In the early hours, you're watching BBC Parliament on BBC Two.
Secretary Justine Greening.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the government's consultation published today, Schools That Work for Everyone, copies of which I have placed in the libraries of both houses. As my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has said, this government is putting the interests of ordinary working class people first. We want this country to be a truly meritocratic country, where what matters most is a person's individual talent and their capacity for hard work. And so we need to build a school system that works for everyone, not just for the privileged few. The various proposals set out today in this consultation document all drive towards one very simple goal: increasing the number of good school places for all children. Over the last 6 years, we have made great strides forward, with over 1.4 million more children in good or outstanding schools than in 2010. The flagship Academies programme has unlocked the potential in our schools. This government is committed to helping all schools enjoy academy status freedom and school-led system improvement throughout multi-academy trusts. And the reforms carried out by my right honourable friends, the member for Surrey Heath and the member for Loughborough, have had a transformational effect on education in our country. Now we need to build on the Education Excellence Everywhere white paper, our dedication to having good teachers in every school, world-class qualifications, and reforming school funding, and put an end to the underperformance that has blighted too many children's education and that still exists in pockets throughout our country. We need to radically expand the number of good school places available to all families, not just those who can afford to move into the catchment areas of the best state schools, or those who can afford to pay for private education, or those belonging of certain faiths. We need to give all schools with a strong track record, with the experience and the valuable expertise, the incentives to expand their offer, to enable even more pupils to go there, driving up standards, giving parents greater choice and control. We've sought to already do this, for example, through university technical colleges and specialist subject schools. The reality is that demand for school places only continues to grow, but too many children still don't have access to a good or outstanding school, and in some areas, as many as 50% of children don't have one locally. In fact, 1.25 million children attend schools which are not good or outstanding in spite of all of the progress that's been made. And that, Mr. Speaker, is unacceptable. The government makes sure that schools have the resources to help children most in need, for example, through the pupil premium, and of course that will continue. But the Prime Minister's right when she says that disadvantage can be often hidden in this country, because it isn't just about those children who receive free school meals. We want to come up with a broader definition and to look at ordinary working class families just managing to get by, who are too often forgotten about. This consultation deliberately asks big, open questions about the future of education in this country. The plans set out in Schools That Work for Everyone focus on how we can unlock 4 existing parts of the educational community so that they can have a bigger impact for all children. Firstly, the independent schools that give wealthier parents the option of an outstanding education for their children, often sending a high proportion to the best universities and guaranteeing access to the best career outcomes. Many of these schools already make a contribution to the state sector. Some even sponsor or run state schools. And while we recognise that work, we want independent schools to do more. So we want stronger, more demanding public benefit tests for independent schools to retain the benefits associated with charitable status. We want independent schools to offer more places to those less able to afford them, and to sponsor or set up schools in the state sector. For smaller schools, we will of course look at a proportionate approach, and we're seeking views on how they can make their facilities available to state schools and share their teaching expertise. Secondly, our world-class universities. They need funding, of course, in order to maintain that status, and under this government's approach to access agreements, we've made sure that we've seen steady investment whilst at the same time also making sure that university isn't out of reach for disadvantaged people. We want the huge talent base in our universities to do more, to widen participation and to help more children to reach their full potential. We therefore want universities to open or sponsor schools in exchange for the right to raise their fees. This will ensure that they aren't just pulling in the most qualified applicants, some of whom might have had an educational head start, Mr. Speaker, but they are also playing a bigger role in increasing the numbers of students with the GCSEs and the A-level grades that open doors to degree courses in the first place. Thirdly, when we talk about selection in this country, we have to acknowledge that we now have selection by house price already. For those who are able to buy a house in the catchment area of the best schools. But we know that selective schools are in high demand, as are specialist art, music and sports schools. Selective schools are good for pupils, particularly the most disadvantaged ones who attend them. And yet, for most children, the chance to attend a selective school simply does not exist. So we want to look again at selective schools and how they can open up excellent places to more children, particularly the most disadvantaged. We will therefore look at how we can relax the rules on expanding selective schools, allow new ones to open and non-selective schools to become selective where there is a demand. At the same time, we have to challenge ourselves and selective schools to raise attainment much more broadly. Mr. Speaker, I think it's really important that I'm clear about how we ensure that all schools improve. We do not want to see a return to the old binary system of good schools and bad schools. Every child deserves a place in a great...
Order. The Secretary of State must be heard. Everybody, I think, on both sides of the House knows that when ministerial statements are delivered, I almost without exception allow everyone who wants to contribute the chance to do so. And believe me, today will be no exception. I'm very sensitive to the differences of opinion in the House. Everyone will have a chance to question the Secretary of State, but meanwhile, she should and must be heard with courtesy. The Secretary of State.
Every child deserves a place in a great school. It's not just what they deserve, it's what our country deserves. And what's clear is that selection should be part of the debate on how we make sure the right number of good places exist. Selective schools will be expected to guarantee places for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And far from tainting the standards of education in schools around them, we will explore ways for selective schools to share their expertise. We want them to raise standards in every part of the school system, for example, by opening excellent feeder primary schools or by sponsoring local non-selective schools. Finally, let me turn to faith schools. I'm sure many colleagues will have children who go to high-quality faith schools. The current rules to promote inclusion mean that when new faith-free schools are oversubscribed, they have to limit the numbers of pupils they admit on the basis of faith to 50%. The reality is that this has not worked to combat segregation, and indeed also acts as a barrier to some faiths in opening new schools. So we want to remove that barrier so that new places can be created, but at the same time, consult on more effective ways to ensure that all new faith-free schools are truly inclusive. We will look at the new requirements on proposers of free schools to demonstrate that they are attracting applications from other faiths, to establish twinning arrangement with schools not of their faith, to consider sponsoring underperforming non-faith schools and bringing members of other faiths and none into their governing bodies. Mr. Speaker, the government wants to build on the progress made over the last 6 years and make the school system truly fit for purpose in the 21st century. The Schools That Work for Everyone consultation is about engaging with as many views as possible so that we can design policies that make the most of the expertise that we already have and widen access to good and outstanding school places for all. We on this side of the House believe in building a true meritocracy. We think that every child deserves a school place that will best serve their individual talents, not limited by where they live or by how much their parents earn. There is so much potential in our country, and that talent base needs us to ask the big questions, leaving no stone left unturned, so that we can build a school system that truly works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'd like to start by offering some advice to the government. Stop your silly class war. Well, Mr. Speaker, that reaction. Well, Mr. Speaker, that reaction is very interesting, because that wasn't my advice. It was the advice of the last Prime Minister. There's still in post, as I think today, as I believe, the Right Honourable Member currently for Witney. When asked about Tory MPs wanting to return to grammar schools, he went on to say, "I think it is delusional to think that a policy of expanding a number of grammar schools is either a good idea, a sellable idea, or even the right idea." He was the future once, but this Prime Minister wants to hark back to the past, where once under Labour we had education, education, education. This government's mantra is segregation, segregation, segregation. So perhaps the Secretary of State can start by telling us when the Prime Minister told her what her education policy was going to be. Because, Mr. Speaker, when she came to this House last Thursday, she told us that there was nothing to announce. She said that we have not yet actually made any policy announcements, that they will be made in due course. And she assured us that she was looking into a range of options. Yet, lo and behold, Mr. Speaker, just 24 hours later, the Prime Minister unveiled their policy in full. Apparently, it did not take that long to look at these options, Mr. Speaker. This is not a surprise. The Prime Minister's plan seems to be that we need grammars, secondary moderns and technical schools. This, Mr. Speaker, is a line taken directly from the Conservatives' 1955 manifesto, hardly an education policy for the 21st century. Was the Secretary of State unaware of the Prime Minister's speech, or did she forget to tell the House? Or perhaps the dog ate that bit of her answer. And today's statement is another sorry excuse. So I have some serious questions that she's yet to answer. Will she confirm that the new Prime Minister has absolutely no mandate for this policy? Not only was no such pledge in their manifesto, but the former Prime Minister, the then Leader of the Opposition, promised precisely not to bring in new grammar schools. He said, "It's not something we would do if elected." So we in this House will hold them to that account, and the country will hold them to that promise. When the Prime Minister's predecessor was asked whether he would cave into his backbenchers over grammar schools, he said, "I lead. I do not follow my party. I lead them." He was able to do this for over 6 years. His successor has hardly managed 6 weeks. And, Mr. Speaker, it is not just the former Prime Minister who opposes these plans. The Right Honourable Member for Loughborough has said of the creation of new grammar schools, "I believe that an increase in pupil segregation on the basis of academic selection is a distraction from the serious efforts to narrow the attainment gap." The Conservative chair of the Education Select Committee said last night, "We have serious issues about social mobility, and I don't think that having more grammar schools is going to help them." And he went on to say, "I think that the creaming off of the best is actually detrimental to the interests of the most." So, Mr Speaker, will the Secretary of State now apologise for dismissing all opponents of her plans by placing dogma over pupils and opportunity? Because all the major research shows that where there are grammar schools today, access to them are limited to the most well-off. It also shows that education attainment in grammar areas for those that fail to get into grammar schools is below the national average. So given the overwhelming academic evidence that grammars fail to improve the standards of the majority of children, what research is she basing her decision on, and will she lay it before this House? And can she explain just how this policy is going to work? She seems to be saying not only can every new school be a grammar, but that every existing school can convert to a grammar as well. I may be a comprehensive girl, Mr Speaker, but even I can see the flaw in thinking you can let every single school in the country select through an exam. So can she tell us just how she will decide which schools will be allowed to segregate pupils and which won't? We are told that the new grammars may be free schools, but free schools are not free to the taxpayer. How much of the school's budget will be put aside for these new grammar schools? And has she received any extra funding from the Treasury? Or will this have to be taken away from the existing schools who are already facing the first real terms cut in decades? Page 25 of the government's consultation document says that for schools to become grammars, one requirement they may have to meet is to establish a new non-selective secondary school with capital and revenue costs paid by the government. Perhaps the Secretary of State can reassure the House that this will be paid for by new funding arrangements that she's reached with the Treasury, rather than being squeezed out of school budgets that are facing a real terms cut.
Order. I think the Shadow Secretary of State is bringing her remarks to a close. I have been generous, but she's a little over her time, and I think she's either finished or approaching her last sentence. Pithy one.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister promised on the steps of Number 10 to govern for the many and not the privileged few, to be led by the evidence when making decisions. Yet now we have a policy that's aimed at not just serving the privileged few, but entrenching that advantage over the rest of society. This is a disgraceful attack on opportunity and inclusion, and we will oppose it. And I applaud every single member of this House to oppose it also.
Secretary of State for Education, Secretary Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to reiterate really to the House that this is the beginning of a consultation that sets out a debate that we need to have in our education system if we are going to make sure we deliver on our manifesto, which is to have an excellent school place available for every single child in our country, and we set out very clearly that that would include more places at grammar schools. I have to say, the Honourable Lady had nothing to say about how we can make independent schools play a stronger role in raising standards. She had nothing to say about how universities can play a stronger role in raising attainment, and she had nothing to say about the fact that in spite of all the challenges and issues that she raises from a Labour perspective on grammar, and it's worth pointing out that the leader of the Labour Party, as I understand it, wants to scrap existing grammars. Is that correct, Mr Speaker? I can't see a flicker of recognition of that policy from the leader of the opposition. Maybe he's had his own distraction over recent weeks. In spite of all of the issues that the Labour Party raises over grammars, and in spite of being in power for 13 years, the party made no steps in government to try to ensure that grammars played a stronger role in raising attainment in their broader communities. And in fact, what do we have? What did we actually see under Labour in government? It wasn't education. It was grade inflation. It was children leaving school without even the most basic skills of knowing how to read and write and add up. We had a university system that had a cap on student numbers and aspiration. We had youth unemployment up by the best part of 50%. So we need no lectures from the party opposite on how to deliver opportunity for our young people. What I can say, Mr Speaker, though, is if we are going to ensure that ours is a country where everybody can do their best wherever they start, we have to be prepared to at least have a debate about how we are going to make that happen. It seems to me that the only distraction in this chamber for the Labour Party is its own leadership contest yet again. And that in the meantime, the ideas and the initiative to make sure that we drive opportunity across Britain will come from this side of the House.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
A few survive. Mr. Speaker, I warmly welcome the motives behind my right honourable friend's statement, which appear to be to try to restore some of the best of the 1944 Butler Act with its amazing opportunities for bright working-class children, whilst avoiding the serious downside which it had, which was the very grave damage it did and the very poor alternatives it offered to the majority of pupils who did not pass the exam. Does she accept that the devil lies in the detail? And as she develops the policy that she's setting out for consultation today, will she accept that it will be tested by how far she can, in specific ways, ensure that this change does not damage the opportunities for any people in other schools, and that it doesn't distract priority from raising the standards of all schools for all pupils, which has been the objective of this government? And then also, can I ask her to reconsider pretty fundamentally the announcement she's made about faith schools, because we need to live in a society where we actually reduce barriers and improve contacts and integration between people of all faiths. And if it has been imperfect, we do need to know why it's not worked, and it may be right to modify it, but isn't just removing this cap altogether going to lead us into very considerable dangers?
He obviously went back some time to talk about the 1944 Butler Act. I don't personally recall it at the time, having not been born then. But the point is that the education system in our country is in a radically different position than it was when essentially there was effectively, as not intended by that Act, but nevertheless a binary system between secondary moderns and grammars. Our education system has transformed out of all recognition now. This is about improving choice for parents wherever they are in the country. It's also about building capacity in our school system, and it's about continuing with the reforms that have already seen 1.4 million more children get into good or outstanding schools. They are absolutely critical alongside this work to making sure that we improve opportunity. On faith schools, let me perhaps explain more succinctly, Mr. Speaker. The existing 50% rule was put in place with the best of intentions. It kicks in when new faith schools are oversubscribed. The issue is that that very rarely happens. So in spite of the best of motives, in fact, the rule doesn't operate effectively, and what we see are some new faith schools that are overwhelmingly comprised of children with one faith, because the school did not have to go and seek more children of other faiths and no faiths. So therefore, the consultation document sets out a number of different proposals that, for example, start with new faith schools that are proposing to set up to more clearly demonstrate that there is a broader community desire for places at that new school, not just from parents of that faith, but also from parents of no faith and other faiths.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State today has expressed concern that opponents of this policy have nothing to say. I reassure the Secretary of State right now that I have plenty to say, but unfortunately I only have 2 minutes in which to say it. In order for any government to be truly progressive, its educational system must do all it can to tackle inequality. Only in this way can our young people reach their true potential. Only in this way can we close the attainment gap, something which the First Minister has made her SNP government in Scotland's mission.
Absolutely.
There can be no doubt that grammar schools encourage educational inequality. That's why there will be no grammar schools in Scotland.
Hear, hear.
The SNP government instead is doing everything possible to ensure all children have access to the same opportunities, no matter their background. If we make the mistake of reintroducing grammar schools in England, if there is any impact any financial impact in Scotland, we in the SNP will fight tooth and nail in our opposition to this policy.
Well, that's the thing.
Instead of this backward step, this government should be working to close the attainment gap. The SNP government in Scotland is committing an additional targeted £750 million to close this gap, with a new, fair and transparent funding formula for schools, ensuring additional resources go where they are needed. Does the Secretary of State not think that she could learn something from this strategy? And can the Secretary of State explain how this government can trumpet its credentials of so-called social mobility when there is clear evidence that such selective admissions policies in schools is not to the benefit of all children? This government says it believes in a meritocratic society, so can the Secretary of State explain how grammar schools promote this when they fly in the face of such an ideal, creating social divisions between children at a very young age?
Hear, hear.
Well, she sets out the SNP's approach on education, but it does not bear comparison to the dramatic improvements that we've seen here in our English education system in the past 6 years that we aim to absolutely continue to drive forward. That's seen stronger focus on school leadership and teaching standards. It's seen a more rigorous and balanced curriculum that truly enables our children to have the knowledge and the skills they need to be successful. And it's also critically seen schools working far more closely together in order to collectively raise attainment standards across the board. What I am saying today is I want to see some of those parts of our education system that have played less of a role in doing that than I think they can step up to the plate and do much, much more. And she asked about the attainment. The reality is that disadvantaged children who get into grammar school come on in leaps and bounds, and in fact the attainment gap is dramatically closed by the time they leave between themselves and their better advantaged cohorts. It's fundamentally the difference between ourselves and the parties opposite is that we believe that that's a good thing, and therefore we should look at how we can make that opportunity available to more children. The parties opposite believe that we should have a levelling down. That is the difference, and that's why we don't accept their approach.
Mr. Michael Gove.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Secretary of State for the clear moral purpose that runs through every word of her statement, her commitment to ensuring that every child in this country receives a high-quality education and that we narrow the attainment gap between rich and poor has been the driving mission that she has taken to the role of Education Secretary, and I, for one, am delighted to see her at the dispatch box. She is absolutely right in particular to say that two of the highest performing education sectors in this country, independent schools and universities, still have not done enough to help disadvantaged children to do more. And is it not the case that the example of the Harris Westminster Free School, supported by a great independent school, and King's Maths School, supported by a great university, shows that you can have institutions that select at the age of 16 that can ensure that children from disadvantaged backgrounds do more? And will she reassure this House that in the face of the opposition to all reform and all debate from the dogmatists on that side of the House, she will be driven entirely by data and what works, and that she will press ahead with the cause of reform?
I can assure him that. I'd like to thank him for his comments and intervention. He was, as Secretary of State, somebody who was willing to press on with difficult decisions in order to get the best outcome for Britain's children, and he was absolutely right to do that. Failure comes from failing to address the difficult questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to improve England's education system. We are prepared to do that. We are putting those proposals out in a consultation document, which is effectively a green paper today. But as he says, there is innovation happening across the system. You look at King's College London and the maths school that you set up. You look at Harris Westminster and that college. You look further afield at the University of Brighton and the work that the University of Exeter is doing. These are universities that are truly showing how they can work with their local school system and more broadly to raise attainment. We should learn from them and expand the impact of universities, not contract it.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let's have the debate, Mr. Speaker, but let's have the debate based on evidence. Can the Secretary of State tell us what evidence she does have that the reintroduction of selection would work? Because all the evidence that I can find shows that it doesn't. Areas that have selection has a wider attainment gap than those that don't. Disadvantaged children don't get into grammar schools, and poorer kids do worse in those areas with selection. In contrast, the highest performing, where the gap has been closing dramatically, particularly under the Labour government, are comprehensive areas. So perhaps the Secretary of State would be better focusing her efforts on how we can spread the good practice of somewhere like, say, London, compared to importing the much poorer practice of somewhere like Kent.
It's not clear to me, and I think it would be helpful for the Labour frontbench and maybe individual Labour MPs to set out exactly where they stand on the issue of removing any existing grammars, which, as I understand it, is the Labour Party proposal, and perhaps from her comments we can assume that she wants to end all existing selection as well. If she's not prepared to make that argument, I think it's very hard to argue against the status quo whilst then also simultaneously arguing that we're wrong to look at reforming it, which I think is the position that she's taking. The reality is that there are many grammar schools that are doing important work. For example, Bournemouth Grammar doing important work to prioritise children on pupil premium getting into grammar schools. We know that when children on free school meals do get into grammars, they disproportionately do well. The evidence on that was from the Sutton Trust. That same evidence also showed that actually children outside of the grammar system, there was no discernible lessening of their attainment more easily. And of course, we are not in a binary system now, Mr. Speaker. We're in a system where overwhelmingly our schools have improved over the last 6 years. There are now many more of all kinds that are good or outstanding. So this sense that somehow if children are not in a grammar, that they are consigned to an education system that is failing them is simply wrong. But we do have to accept that there are some schools in some parts of the country where children don't have access to a good school place, and we shouldn't accept that. The proposals and the debate that we're starting today is one aimed at looking at how we can tackle it. It sits alongside a much broader series of policy reforms, but we are going to make sure that we push on and change that circumstance, unlike the party opposite, which seems to not even want to have a debate in the first place.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome what my right honourable friend has said today about greater collaboration between universities and independent schools and those in the state system? Can I also agree with what she said about faith schools? I think that she is right and that this does need to be looked at. And over the past 6 years on this side of the House, we have consistently challenged the soft bigotry of low expectations that says that an academic education isn't available to all. She's right to say that we have great schools and great teachers, but we don't have them everywhere. So could she explain now, or perhaps in the course of the consultation, how the Green Paper proposals on selective education will benefit those pupils in areas where expectations are still too low, where results are too poor? And can she tell us when she's going to announce the first of the Achieving Excellence areas?
Well, she's right to point out that too often in the past, I don't think governments have had high enough expectations for children growing up in more disadvantaged parts of our country. I think that's totally unacceptable. There are talented children growing up all over our country, and we should make sure they have an education system that can enable them to make the most of those talents. But she's also right to point out that if we want to see new grammars open, we have to work with local communities. But I would very much like to see some of the most disadvantaged communities in our country perhaps get the chance now to have a grammar. At the moment, that is simply not an opportunity for them, even if local parents want it. And we know that 20% of children who are at grammar schools come from outside the immediate catchment area. It clearly suggests that parents in those broader areas also want the choice of a grammar for their children. And finally, on the points that she set out in the white paper, which I thought was quite right, the Achieving Excellence areas were all about saying, actually, We need to look systematically in places where there is systematic letting down of children, where they don't have access to good school places, and look at what it's going to take, not just inside schools, but I also think outside schools, to make sure that we change that over time. So I can absolutely assure her that all of that work will continue, and I'd like to pay tribute to her for the white paper that she set out that put in place the building bricks of what I hope will be a successful approach.
Mr. Stephen Twigg.
It's simply not true to say that on this side of the House we're in favour of levelling down. Schools that work for everyone and all families is exactly what members on this side of the House are in favour of. And I want to press the Secretary of State on this question of evidence. Where is the evidence that any of the improvement we've seen in the last 15 to 20 years has come as a result of selection? And in particular, can she name a school system elsewhere in the world that succeeds on the basis of selection at 11?
Well, our proposals are very clear that we don't want to see a test at 11, if you like, be the main principal way that children get into grammars. We want much more flexibility in the grammar system. And this is about having a 21st century education system, but also a 21st century approach on grammars. I think it's wrong to say that we should just freeze grammars in time and never come back at look at how they can work more effectively. But the test is surely the fact that 99% of grammars are judged to be good or outstanding by Ofsted. These are schools that have outstanding leadership, outstanding teachers, a strong, stretching, rigorous curriculum. They deliver for children who are of lower prior attainment and disadvantaged, but also stretch those that are of better attainment. And that's why they're rated by Ofsted as good or outstanding. We'd be wrong not to look at how we can pull those features into the broader school system. That's what many of our reforms have been doing. But we should be enabling, where there's choice and where there's demand, for more grammars to open up.
Neil Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Back in 1944, of course, there are three types of school proposed: grammar, secondary modern and technical schools. But by 1959, only 2% of any year group could expect to get to a technical school. So the problem actually is sometimes in delivery and the mechanism for the implementation. So my question is to the Secretary of State. What plans has she got to make sure that the changes that she is talking about in the Green Paper will actually be implemented in such a way that we do reach every community, that we do reach every child, and that we can be sure that we are giving every child the best possible opportunity in a grammar school or another school of some different type? Because it is the mechanism, and it is the brokering of that mechanism and the checking that that mechanism that is working that will actually count for a lot in this whole policy.
Well, I very much pay tribute to all of his work as chair of the Education Select Committee looking in this area. This is about building capacity. It's fundamentally about having more good school places for children around Britain. And I think what you will see as a test of its success is a continued improvement in attainment, very much following on from what my right honourable friend, the member for Surrey Heath, has said, but particularly focusing on those children who at the moment don't get as far as they should and haven't been able to enjoy and benefit from the broader reforms that so many more children now are.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I tell the Secretary of State that this country has made very steady progress in education over the years under all parties. There's been real improvement in our education system. And is she aware that sending a message that it's been a history of failure isn't very encouraging, that the teachers and the people that deliver education? But can I just please beg her not to start what we've seen in the chamber already, a bitter range war about comprehensives against grammar. Grammar schools, if you like them, provide the evidence, provide what's best for our students and our kids in this country. Do not start this ideological turf war that's going to be very damaging to our country.
Well, I agree with him. I think we need to open up a measured debate that's based on evidence about what it's going to take to improve our school system, and particularly for those children who don't have access to a good school place, what it's going to take to enable them to have one. We believe that selection can play a role in that, and we should look at how that can be done more effectively. And he was at the urgent question that we had on Thursday. I recognise very much how emotive this issue is across the House. That's because it matters. It matters for all of our children. But I think the wrong thing to do would be to simply see the kinds of concerns that the members opposite express and then simply put them in a box over here and not be prepared to look at how we can make grammars work more effectively for disadvantaged children. But in doing so, we should also recognise that every child is different, and for those that are academic, they need schools that can help them stretch themselves.
Teresa Villiers.
My anxiety with some of these proposals is that the Secretary of State rightly focuses on areas of economic and educational disadvantage, but without any kind of local catchment area, how can we guarantee that new selective schools will actually benefit the communities in which they're situated?
Well, we're setting out a number of conditions that new grammars would have to meet, frankly, for them to be able to open in the first place. And of course, part of that would be working with local communities and demonstrating local demand, but it could also involve them setting up a non-selective school or sponsoring one that's already there. It could also involve them setting up or sponsoring a primary school that feeds the grammar school that is in a more low-income area, so that it absolutely reaches into some of those communities that we want to see benefit most from good or outstanding grammars that are being established. So I would encourage her to look at the consultation document. It opens a lot of questions about how we can do this effectively, and then I've no doubt be interested in her response.
Dr. John Pugh.
Speaker, I've listened to the Secretary of State carefully, and I'm quite sorry for her in a way, because I'm sure this isn't directly her policy. Could you tell us confidentially whether she was as surprised as we were when we found out the chaotic nature of future government policy and when she was informed of it by government spads in Downing Street?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think on behalf of children in Britain, that was a totally pointless question, and in fact, I'm not going to bother answering it.
Anna Soubry.
Mr. Speaker, look, I don't want any child to have to go to the sort of school that I went to in the last 5 years of my secondary education. The Heartland Comprehensive, Mr. Speaker, many times was more like a borstal than a school, and unfortunately there are still too many comprehensives like that in our country. But, and it's a big but, the schools in my constituency have done so well, notably George Spencer becoming an outstanding academy because of the academy programme. And I think in my constituency there's no desire for us to have selection. So can the Secretary of State assure me and my constituents that the academy programme which is delivering will still be supported by this government?
Yes, of course, and indeed this is about providing more choice. But as she sets out, in many parts of the country, we've seen academies really transform prospects already. So it may be that for her local community, they are happy with those existing schools and they want to continue to see those get better.
Catherine McKinnell.
Discussing education with parents and teachers, the issues that come up time and time again are the need for more primary places, teacher workload and recruitment, and the north-south funding gap. Not one person has ever raised new grammars with me. Secretary of State, where is the evidence that this continued obsession with structures is going to resolve the real issues facing our education system?
But she's right to highlight the need for more primary places, and actually we've put billions into ensuring that those places are there. Part of the challenge is that demographic bulge is now gradually passing into our secondary school system, and we also need to make sure that the secondary school system has the numbers of places that our children will need, but we need to make sure they're good places, which is why we want to open up this debate on selection, open up this debate about ending the ban on grammars. And as she says, this is not to say that there isn't the rest of the agenda in education that we need to carefully push on with. She talks about teacher recruitment, she talks about making sure that education funding is fair around the country, and absolutely all of those things will be ones I continue to focus on.
Sir Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I welcome my right honourable friend's commitment to greater freedom for faith schools, including Yavna in my constituency, which is the best performing comprehensive in the entire country. It forms part of a diverse mix in Hertsmere, which includes part selective schools. Does she agree with me that it's that diversity which is driving up standards, and is she committed to to maintaining that diversity?
He sets out the case very well in terms of how parents have got more and better choice in his own local community. It is important, it is part of how we see standards rise, and we're committed to that continuing.
Mr. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I also listened very carefully to the words of the Secretary of State, and she did say we don't want to see a test at 11 for access to grammars. So is it her intention to abolish the 11 plus for existing grammar schools? And if not, why not?
The point I was making to him was that many people feel that there's a cliff edge in terms of the entry into grammars as it stands at age 11. We're consulting on having the chance for children to go into a local grammar perhaps at an older age, or indeed if they're particularly capable at 1 or 2 subjects, that they perhaps could go to a grammar to study those. So I'm sure he'll read the consultation document with interest.
Lucy Fraser.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that when lifting the statutory bar, we're not returning to a 2-tier system of the 1950s, in circumstances where our education system has moved on, where we have choice of UTCs, free schools, academies, as well as apprenticeships? And when striving for educational excellence, we must continue to look at all forms of the best forms of education for our children.
Good question. She's quite right. We've moved from a system where there was a one-size-fits-all approach on schools for children, and we now have a system where there's so much more diversity and choice, but we do think it's wrong to have one kind of school within that system unable to respond to parent demand, and that's the need for more grammars. So we want to open up that debate and look at what we can do to enable parents to have more of a choice around the country.
Jim Shannon.
Speaker, Minister, when it comes to schools that work for everyone, the Minister says she wants to get views from everywhere. The Education Minister will be aware that the exam results from schools in Northern Ireland for GCSE were some of the best in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Has the Education Minister had the opportunity to strategise these results for the benefit of the UK mainland?
Well, I know that the system of grammars in Northern Ireland is one that people would point to say that on average attainment has increased, and I was invited to Northern Ireland in the urgent question last week to look for myself, and I'm sure that I will be able to visit Northern Ireland shortly.
Keith Simpson.
I welcome the Secretary of State's Green Paper on the wider aspects of education. I have to say that I have severe reservations about introducing more grammar schools. I was at a grammar school 50 years ago, and I've often wondered if I had failed the 11 plus, where I would be. I certainly wouldn't be here today, and I know the educational system has moved on, but I have to say that I think it's not a question of introducing more grammar schools. If people want grammar schools, that is fine. It's what's happening in the main part of the system. Yes. And the main question that we have to deal with is not just about access to schools, it's about the poverty of many of the parents, the dysfunctional families, and I'm sure that my right honourable friend is going to be looking at this, and if she could perhaps give me some reassurance that this is going to be done.
Very much so. As I just replied to my right honourable friend for Loughborough, this issue of looking at specific areas where there is a persistent, a long-term lack of educational attainment and a gap in good school places absolutely has to sit alongside this consultation document and the rest of the government reforms that we have now well underway that have delivered so much for children in Britain. Absolutely need to continue.
Nick Brown.
The Secretary of State's statement is deeply divisive. Will she say to the House what the difference is between the selection criteria for a grammar school and the selection criteria for a free school? And will she say to the House what the evidence base is available to her for not prioritising the needs of the young people who are not going to be selected?
Well, I would encourage him to look at the Green Paper consultation document that we've published today, it very much not only talks about how we think that grammars can play a stronger role, and selection play a stronger role in particularly improving the prospects for disadvantaged children who are academically able, but it also sets out our expectation that grammars can do a lot more in their local communities to raise attainment more broadly. And as I said to the honourable lady opposite, the challenge is that this is not a reform that's been engaged with grammars before, and it is time that we ask them to do more, but in return we should also be prepared to enable them to open up in other parts of the country.
Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have no ideological hang-up against letting the brightest children do well. I think it's crucial, however, that we let the poorest come through to do so. I welcome this as the beginning of a debate. I welcome this as one method by which we can increase the diversity of the school system. Can I particularly welcome the mention she is making of the role that universities can play? We see the results of poor social mobility in my constituency, in Norwich. Universities, as well as existing teachers, are addressing this hard and should be encouraged.
Well, I think Norwich is an excellent example of a place where we could see attainments particularly raised by the University of East Anglia doing more in local communities, and I'd like to pay tribute to the work that she's doing locally with her young people to try and help make sure that that happens. I think we're at the beginning of understanding how universities can work effectively further back in the education system, but the more we can work out how to do that successfully, what we see when it is done successfully is it can dramatically improve the prospects for children so that they get the levels of educational attainment that means going to university becomes an option.
Tristram Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the government was serious about social mobility, it would be focusing on the early years and technical and vocational provision. But the one thing I do welcome is the Secretary of State's acceptance of the Labour Party's 2015 manifesto commitment on independent schools. And of course, they should be doing more to earn their charitable status. I think we're entering a consensus view on this. But rather than going down the blind alley of the Charitable Commission, can I urge the Secretary of State to amend the 1988 Local Government Act so that private schools' business rate relief is dependent on a hard partnership as determined by the Independent Schools Inspectorate. It remains a scandal that our sixth form colleges are paying VAT and private schools have business rate relief. This has to end.
Well, as I understood his policy, it was just simply to scrap charitable status. What we want to do is to make sure that our independent schools actually earn that charitable status and truly deliver more public benefit, perhaps, than some are doing at the moment. Although it's fair to say that most overwhelmingly, many independent schools already do much in their local communities.
William Ragg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as a comprehensive schoolboy, can I commend my right honourable friend for this bold new departure? Will she, however, at all times ensure that the language used by the government focuses on pupils' aptitudes rather than solely on their academic ability? Because I believe in that way there are no losers. Instead, all talents are champions and pupils fulfilled. Very well said.
As a comprehensive school girl, I think that's an excellent point, and I can assure him that this is about making sure that we have the diversity and choice in our school system so that whatever kind of talents you have as a child, you can find a school that will truly enable you to develop them and to be successful.
Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The attainment gap between poor and rich children is unacceptable. It holds them and our country back. But the Secretary of State is simply wrong to say that expanding grammar schools will help the most disadvantaged children, who are less likely to get into grammar schools and fall further behind better-off children than those in areas without selective schools. Can I ask the Minister to instead focus on what we know from the evidence makes the biggest difference to disadvantaged children? High-quality early years services, getting the best heads and teachers in the schools that need the most, and relentlessly driving up standards in academic and vocational qualifications.
Well, 2 points. We're doing all of those things, and the reality is that our proposals are aimed at ensuring that grammars do take more disadvantaged children, and all I would say is Labour had 13 years to look at this and failed to do so.
Conor Burns.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will be aware that the community that I represent in Bournemouth and Poole already has access to high-quality local grammar schools. But can I make her aware of the change in the admission policy from 2018 for Bournemouth School, headed by Dr. Dorian Lewis, where we are going to put a geographic limit prioritising Bournemouth pupils. We are going to prioritise looked after and formally looked after children, prioritise those on free school meals, and combine this, and this is critical, with an ambitious programme of outreach to the primary schools to raise the aspiration both of primary school pupils and their parents about sending their children to these schools. Would she agree with me that this is an ambitious thing that is totally in line with the Prime Minister's excellent new policy? And would she agree either to come to Bournemouth School to see at first hand what they're doing, or to meet Dr. Dorian Lewis, the head teacher, if we bring him here to London?
I'm very happy to meet his local head teacher, and what he sets out in terms of what that school is doing is exactly what we want to see happening, replicated across grammar schools in our country, but also in terms of the conditions that we'll set for existing grammars to expand and for new grammars to open up. We really do want to make sure that they are engines for social mobility.
Caroline Flint.
I hope we do have a debate, because it's important, because none of us should be satisfied that too many of our children aren't getting the best out of, what is it these days, nearly 18 years it will be before too long, of compulsory education. But when I last spoke in this chamber in a debate led by my former colleague Jo Cox, we talked about the lack of education attainment in Yorkshire and Humberside, and 3 things came out of that. 1, that so many of our children are behind 18 months their peers at the age of 3. 2, that in places like Doncaster and elsewhere outside of our cities, we can't attract the best teachers for love nor money. And thirdly, the choice at 14 isn't good enough for those who want to follow a more vocational route. Can I ask the Secretary of State, please, do not abandon those areas that I feel are of greater importance to achieving the outcomes she wants than a debate that could be divisive on grammar schools.
Well, I can absolutely assure her that I won't ever abandon that agenda of looking at some of our more struggling areas in terms of educational attainment and seeing what we can do to lift them. I grew up in Rotherham. I went through the state school system there. I am personally committed to making sure that that area does better in the future than it's done in the past. And for me, to be able to have a role now where I can actually help build the education system that enabled me to be successful, I think is a chance and an opportunity that I will make the most of.
David T.C. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Minister is indeed going to search for evidence, will she try and find out why the OECD have consistently said that educational outcomes in England are far higher than they are in Wales, where we have had 17 years of Labour government?
I think it's almost certainly because the Labour government in Wales has failed to learn from the reforms that we've made here in the United Kingdom. And it's interesting, we're having a debate about grammar schools, but the reality is that many parents want the features of grammar schools that often make them successful, which is excellent teachers and outstanding leadership, a stretching, rigorous academic curriculum, and excellent extracurricular activities as well. Those are the things, and discipline, these are the things that parents want across the school system, and our reforms have largely embedded them across the school system, and that's why we're seeing standards going up.
Fiona McTaggart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am proud to represent a town which is ram-packed with what she calls ordinary working class people. We are also a town, I'm using the Secretary of State's words, it's also a town which has grammar schools. And those people are very frustrated that their kids can't get into local grammar schools because people with much more resources are able to drive miles from West London and get into grammar schools on the basis of the 11+. Now, I'm beginning to not be sure what she means by a grammar school, because when I talk to the heads in the grammar schools, they say they cannot make a test for admission which is tutor-proof. And the point is, my constituents, those who can't afford tutors, are not getting places in the grammar schools. And therefore, grammar schools do not serve, as her statement implies, those ordinary, in her words, ordinary working class people. Unfortunately, it serves those people who can afford to tutor their kids.
But I think that in that case, it's all the more reason for us to be bringing forward the reforms that we're doing today. I find it nonsensical to make an argument in the way that she's just done, and then we should say we should do nothing about it.